Welcome to Integrated Wellbeing YouTube channel and podcast for people in grief and the professionals who serve them. We're here to provide education, inspiration, and practical tools for our audience by interviewing those bereaved by loss, mental health professionals, and grief specialists. Our mission at the Integrated Wellbeing Institute is to awaken the griever to their inner peace through the guidance of their body. And today I'm delighted to introduce to you Dr. Robert Neimeyer, PhD. Hi, Bob. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm very happy to be beginning a conversation with you in any context, Georgena.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give my audience just a tiny bit of background, and then there will be the full information on the YouTube channel and podcast. So Dr. Robert Neimeyer is a professor emeritus of the Department of Psychology, University of Memphis, and maintains an active consulting and coaching practice. He also directs the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition, which provides online training internationally in grief therapy. He's published 33 books, including New Techniques of Grief Therapy, Bereavement and Beyond. So it's so good to be able to speak with you more about this fabulous text. Thanks so much.
Well, I'm eager to do it.
Okay, good. Well, the very first question I usually ask most of our guests are, what drew you to this? What drew you to grief therapy, Bob?
Well, you ask all the right questions, and you start with the hardest one first, so it can only get easier from here, Georgena.
You got it.
There are the obvious reasons that I got into the area. I developed a fascination with grief and loss, and I began working in a suicide and crisis intervention center when I was in college, my first year. And just from there began to really hear the call of people's suffering as a function of losses, some of them quite traumatic and untimely. But the deeper answer, of course, would have to go into my own personal history of loss. And in that, there really were a couple of tragedies that in my youth, I think, predisposed me to take seriously the recognition of the impermanence of human life and its implications for us. And one was that my grandmother on my father's side lived with us for some years, and she died in our home when I was about 8 years old. And I was very attached to her. Her name was Katie Clancy, and she was as Irish as they came. And she was a charming and lovely and doting grandmother. So she was keenly missed. I was the oldest of 3 children at that time, and I think all of us sensed her absence very powerfully. But so too did my father. And I think that her death, in combination with many other factors, some of which I will never know, as both he and my mother have now died, and other close witnesses to his life are also passed. He ended up developing a deep depression, a strong addiction to alcohol, in the context of his encroaching blindness from untreatable glaucoma, the financial instability of the pharmacy or drugstore that he operated as a family pharmacy for many years. As retail drug chains began to come on the scene and he couldn't compete. And I think a host of demons then dragged him down, and he ended his life in an act of suicide 10 days before my 12th birthday. And so I think that those kind of twin losses really probably made me keenly aware, as a child could be at least, on the threshold of adolescence, of the impact of such loss. And that played out across the following decade as my mother flirted with and attempted suicide multiple times herself in the aftermath of Dad's dying. So hence my volunteering in a suicide and crisis intervention center, and ultimately beginning to focus my research and my practice as a psychologist in people's adaptation, for better or worse, to this difficult life transition that accompanies bereavement.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I did not know all of those things. So yes, when we have someone die of suicide and then those multiple attempts, that's something. I interviewed Dr. Stacy Friedenthal a couple weeks ago, and her book is Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts. And that was a fascinating book to read and learn from as well, because that has a certain energy that it brings to the house and to one's life.
But losses of all kinds bring their own energy to our lives. And I very much like the focus on integration that is featured even in the title of your broadcast, and also, of course, clearly in your life, because I think in many ways we can understand the goal of grieving as integrating the experience of loss, not only at a cognitive level, but at a heartfelt level, making it a reality, acknowledging it, but also making equally real the possibility of reinventing and in some ways continuing and even growing our bonds with those who have died if they have been important and constructive players in our lives. So yeah, that idea of just finding a way to incorporate the multiple losses of our lives into our life story, recognizing that that story continues to evolve, but they have a central place and they can inform us moving forward.
And I really appreciated the very first article in the book, which you wrote, and it was Continuing Bonds. And so if you'd say more about that, because the new paradigm of grief from Integrated Wellbeing Institute is we're not broken by this loss. We're broken open like a seed to grow in self-awareness and new connections.
It's well put, the way you phrased that. I had a conversation with my sister yesterday on the phone, and her name is Jo. Jo has experienced a plenitude of adversities in her life, right through the current serious cancer diagnosis she has, but also experiences of abuse and loss of many kinds, beginning, of course, in childhood with shared losses, but right on through the course of living. She has lost many and much. Her home burned down as just one prominent example, and took with her all cherished life possessions and also a marriage. And she was speaking with the kind of hard-won philosophy that she's cultivated in spirituality. And she said, Bob, really the only thing that teaches us deep lessons in our lives are the tragedies, traumas, and losses we've had. She said nothing else will call us into that soulful and deep reflection that produces profound transformation. And I have gradually made peace with and accepted the role of tragedy in life as my most important teacher. And I thought that was, I have some tingles up my spine as I say that. Some of those, probably many of those who are listening, have heard that call and are trying to answer it in their own ways, to a deeper understanding of self and world, and because we might understand grieving as a process of relearning the self and relearning the world. The old versions often seem to die with our loved ones, and the new version is the one that we work to kind of rebuild. So continuing bond approach, which you had expressed interest in talking about, really recognizes that we seek not to relinquish those we've loved and lost. We look for ways instead to continue the connection and to essentially reinvent the bond in light of their physical absence, but emotional and perhaps relational and spiritual presence in our lives. We can often hear their voice, their values bearing on us, providing us orientation, sharpening our life purpose, deepening our compassion for others who suffer. And we may feel even the possibility of conducting a kind of quiet, silent internal dialogues with them, or carrying out light projects that honor them in some way. And so all of this, of course, fits within the range of continuing bonds expressions that are common across spiritual and cultural communities. We don't so much leave the dead as we learn to relate to them differently. We love them in a sustainable way that's different in some respect than when they were available to hold in our arms.
Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting because so many people have such different ways of creating those new bonds. And is there one that you find that comes through, or is, I don't want to say the word easy, but it's the most useful? Is there a strategy or a process or a thought?
Well, I suppose the most commonplace expression of how we reinvent or realign our bonds with others after their death is really by keeping their stories alive. You know, finding those safe people, communities, building those safe families in which we can speak their names, share a story. Maybe it's a story that brings a bittersweet tear to all of us. Maybe it brings a hearty laugh. Maybe it brings a sense of pride or interest in learning more, maybe from a listener. It's when others share those stories with us that maybe include experiences with our loved one that we didn't have, that we come to know them better, even in their absence. So I imagine that the sharing of stories in both directions is the most commonplace way, but there are, of course, many others.
Certainly. I'm so happy to hear you talk about the stories. I had a client in my office today, and she said, I think everybody is tired of hearing about him. So when you ask me to tell you more about him, it brings me a relief.
Yes, isn't that nice?
Mm-hmm.
And also, when we find a way of expressing the deep and genuine interest that goes beneath the well-rehearsed stories or anecdotes that people will tell, but that probes into it. And boy, what you say that she gave you this very special gift. And I wondered what that gift meant to her to give to you. We just ask follow-up questions that reveal layers of love or intention that in some way amplify the story. They grow the roots to the story. What kind of person was she to think of doing just that for you? Or were there times that she drove you a little bit crazy? Can I hear about one of those stories too?
Yes.
And so in this way, I think when we find an audience for the relationship, it helps solidify it. It gives it a contemporary relevance. It's not just a part of our past, it's part of our living present and our hoped for future.
One of the things we do in the Suicide Bereavement Northwest support groups that we have, many of them now in person again, is we will say, tell us about your person. We'd like to know more about them. And it's just such a wonderful way for those in the group to be introduced to the person that's no longer present in the physical.
Exactly. That's a lovely practice. And colleagues of mine who practice narrative therapy adopt a similar stance because it really practices a person-first way of counseling or providing support rather than a problem-first focus. Tell me about your suffering. Tell me about your pain. We need to be able to hear that too, non-reactively, to make a space for people's grief. But ultimately, we need to understand that grief as a function of the particular person they lost, the particular relation that no longer physically exists for them. And so I like that idea of starting with the person and then exploring the ongoing relation.
Thank you. And I was particularly taken by the grieving styles grid in the book. And I'm wondering if you would explain that for the professionals who are listening and how you've used that with groups of people grieving, because it's brilliant.
Well, I'm glad you think so. And maybe we can even suggest that they get the book themselves.
Yes.
I'm not too sure that my description of it will be adequate, but if you can visualize, imagine a giant checkerboard. And what I actually use for this exercise when I'm working with small groups is a checked tablecloth. So maybe it has black and red squares or black and white squares, like an old picnic table tablecloth. And I put it across a table or two to make a big playing board. And then I ask the participants, it may be in, say, a therapy group or a support group, to go to a table I got off on the side, and I've got maybe a lovely scarf on that, and on that I have scattered a whole bunch of stones of different sizes, all of them smallish, some of them with rough textures, some broken, some polished and colorful. Maybe I have beads of glass, maybe I have small pine cones, seashells, feathers, a variety of natural media. They take one that represents themselves in some way, just choosing intuitively. And then they have a little group in which they talk with one another about, why did I choose this polished kind of tiger's eye cube? And well, because I see myself as having many layers, right? And polished on the outside, sometimes a little hard on the inside. So then they take these pieces, and I invite them to place them on the playing surface and to move in one direction, forward or back, according to questions that ask about essentially examples of how they in their family or community would respond to loss. Like when you were a little girl, Georgena, right? And you were upset and crying because you'd lost something. Would people tell you to dry your tears and be a big girl? If so, move 2 spaces forward, right? Would they tell you, would they try to mollify you and say, there, it'll be all right, and then offer you a piece of candy? Would they sit with you and ask you what was wrong, honey? If so, move in the other direction. And so in this way, people begin to describe a style of grieving that is maybe more expressive versus more stoic. We're kind of trained in one way or another. There are many questions of various kinds that kind of help you get a bead on that. You move back and forth, up and down, based on that. And then another is a dimension of continuing bonds versus letting go. How much do you really invest in maintaining your connection with someone you have loved and lost physically? Or do you focus on sort of seeking closure and moving on? And a variety of questions help you with that. So ultimately then you're moving forward and across in one direction or the other, and people end up scattering across this grid in ways that reveals their similarity to some people and the difference from others. And then I have people get together and talk about it in small groups, like what makes us different than them.
Yes.
And then they talk about the advantages and the drawbacks of their own grieving style. You can also do that as an individual. You don't have to do it as part of a group. So that's the grieving styles grid. It's a way of recognizing the variety in grief. We don't all grieve the same way. And these are 2 big dimensions. Do we tend to let go or hold on? Do we tend to express emotion or inhibit emotion? And different cultures, different people, different families will tend to move in one direction or another on that grid.
And what I was taken by is the validation for those people that are there in that circle. No, there's no right. There's no wrong. It's, oh, yes, this is the way I was raised. No wonder I'm grieving this way. And it allows them that self-awareness and appreciation of their style of grieving, which could be 180 degrees different than a sibling's.
Exactly. And one thing that we often do as well is we offer people a chance to say, are there aspects of your style that you are working to change, or that you would wish to change if you could? What would those be and why? And so to understand our grieving style as something that's mutable, changeable, that it's not just we're stuck with these difficult emotions, right? But in some way we can begin to imagine doing our grieving differently, maybe a little more openly, maybe a little less. And so that's another invitation.
Yes. So any of you who are professionals listening, I highly recommend getting the book, because the questions are just profound. It will give you so much insight into working with your clients. And those of you who are listening in as people grieving, it's a wonderful opportunity too, to increase that self-awareness and understand where you're coming from. And one of the things that is a question that I get so often is, how long will this take? And this grief process, how long will this take? And my answer is always, it will take as long as it takes. And it's been interesting to me to find that there's grief research out there that says, oh, healthy grieving is 2 years. And then there's yours that, the difficult adjustments, 18 to 48 months. And I don't like to put a number on things. I give that general information. What do you say to people when they ask you that question?
Well, in some ways, I guess I would say that the grieving will take as long as you do. That is, it will last in some fashion for the rest of your life. A cardinal loss will always will have its place in your life. It will leave a mark. Mm-hmm. But that as we move forward, we have some decisions we can make about how we are going to bear that loss. And so if we acknowledge that in some way the grief is always something that is available to us, we've lost a child, we will always be someone who has experienced that will help shape us. But the quality of the grief can change across time. It can leaven, it can lighten, it can even instruct. So I don't see the goal of grieving to be to somehow find the spigot and turn it off. Mm-hmm. But we want to be able to stand in the presence of that grief, both as therapists or helping persons and as mourners ourselves. We want to be able to do that in a way that is more emotionally regulated, where we don't feel overwhelmed to dangerous degrees by the emotion. We can come to acknowledge it in all of its strength and severity, but we can also find ways of self-compassionately soothing ourselves and seeking the soothing presence of others who can accompany us in this. So we relate in order to regulate. Mm. So I think that there are ironies about grieving. One is that we rarely choose to lose someone we love, but having had that experience, we find that grieving can be rich in choice, and that it isn't a simple thing. In the early weeks and months of losing a child or partner, we may be carried away in a storm of emotion with great frequency. But ultimately, we can learn to navigate those seas. We can find the safe harbors of other relations to pull up into, to take on provisions and to kind of restock our supplies and then sail back out onto the seas of life. So that's my overall take. Now, I could also speak diagnostically, and that might be helpful for people to hear. But in this deeper existential way, I want to convey the idea that grieving is an adaptive process. It can become less adaptive if we get stuck and frozen in a bad place that greatly challenges our functioning in crucial roles over a period of many months or years. In those cases, then something more than bereavement support might be called for. That's the proper role of grief therapy with someone who can help with those stuck places. But we know from research that 90% of mourners will ultimately grieve adaptively. And many of us are surprisingly resilient in the early aftermath of loss. So adaptation and growth is more the norm. Getting stuck, however, can be something very real and very dangerous when we find we're in an unchanging grief across a period of years that is costing us much and many.
Mm-hmm. And so for all of you who are in that place of grieving, I heard you say, we are resilient. There are many ways for us to know that grief will always be with us. It becomes different when we get to a place, or if we get to that place of being stuck. That's really the time to reach out for professional help.
That's right. Yeah, because there are all sorts of ways of seeking the presence and companionship of others who know this walk, and others who have had similar forms of loss can be a source of wisdom and comfort for us.
Well, and that's why I'm so pleased about the Institute, because you have a variety of staff members, so faculty members. So if you tell us something about the Portland Institute, please.
Well, thank you for asking about that. The Portland Institute for Loss and Transition is really a global training institute for people who do this work, whether they are social workers, chaplains, nurses, counselors, psychologists, people in the helping professions in general, who want to develop a deeper and richer fund of skills in accompanying people in grief. And so we have a well-developed curriculum with actually 5 certification tracks. Grief therapy as meaning reconstruction. We're looking at grieving as a process of rebuilding a world of meaning that has been challenged by loss. That theme pervades all of our programs. We have family-focused grief therapy, with a focus on children and family systems. And we have arts-assisted grief therapy, which is purely delightful, using the visual arts, performative arts, in order to help people really move beyond what words themselves can tell us, as they may use collage or memory boxes and all manner of creative media to explore these very internal experiences in a way that lets us externalize them and begin to work with them. We have grief therapy for non-death losses, recognizing the way in which people may experience not only grief from bereavement, but from the loss of not only people, but places, projects, possessions, professions, possibilities, all of which were life-defining for us, and that can occasion genuine grief when we lose them. I mentioned my sister's house burning down as an example. And there's a strong focus in that on compassion-focused grief therapy, for example. And then finally, we have grief therapy for suicide bereavement, which is a brand new program that we just launched. And in fact, in just a couple of weeks, on May 4th and 5th, we're having 2 very special modules of that that are collaboratively presented by Jack Jordan, a well-known contributor to this area, and a client of his, Rebecca Ladd, who lost a son to suicide. And they're going to have a first-person experience description of what that's like and what therapy was like that they did together. So the Portland Institute offers a great deal of online training and also on-site training in various places around the world. We work with different organizations, providing tailor-made training for them. And so that's what that's about. We have a wonderful international cast of specialists in this area, all of whom are whole human beings and good companions.
And so do people need to take the meaning module first? Is it
Yeah, well, yes, in some way we have 6 core courses, but a course is simply 3 hours.
Okay.
So that is our basic certification. Those 6 modules are 18 hours. But you can take just a single module. Maybe you are interested in that suicide bereavement piece that I talked about. You can just sign up for that.
Okay.
It's priced to be affordable, and you can take courses in any sequence you like at any pace you want. So there's a lot of flexibility to tailor to your interests.
Good. Well, we're so grateful to you for putting this together and taking it across the world, because people grieve so differently.
It's really true. I'm doing a lot of work, for example, now in Mexico, Colombia, in Spain, and in these Hispanic cultures, there is a different orientation to grief and loss, a somewhat different spirituality, a different communitarian spirit. Especially in Mexican culture, a comfort with the dead, as expressed in El Día de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, where families will get together overnight and have elaborate dinners on the tombstones of their loved ones. It's a remarkable culture.
Mm-hmm. It is indeed. And so I wanted to ask you today about anxiety and grief, because there appears to be so much more anxiety in our culture. And I'm curious if it might be an underlying grief. So could you just speak to that, please?
Yes, I think it is interesting to recognize somewhat counterintuitively that grief has more to do with anxiety than it does with depression. The commonplace understanding is the reverse, that basically grief is a kind of depression, and this is why doctors will offer you antidepressants to get you out of it. And that can be helpful, because a major depressive disorder, a kind of a dark cloud that descends on you and doesn't lift, can accompany grief. But grief ultimately has more to do, even at neurological levels, with anxiety states, particularly generalized anxiety disorder, where there's a sense of pervasive kind of fearfulness, because it is at root a kind of separation anxiety in connection with a loved one. In the same way that a child, maybe a young child of 3 or 4 years old, who loses his or her mother in a grocery store and begins crying and searching and maybe freezing and just hoping she'll come back if we scream loud enough. There's a kind of young child in us that responds similarly. Or if we are parents who lose a child, then we know the terrible separation anxiety of, if we lose our child in such a context, then we run panic looking for them. So some of that same psychological response to the rupture of a bond occurs in the context of grief of many kinds. So it does drive the anxiety. Of course, when we compound grief with fearfulness of many kinds, then we can exaggerate that. We can ratchet it up still more. The period of COVID, when we were so isolated and deprived of really necessary relations, certainly was a context that induced anxiety and fear. Many of us lost people we love in the context of that. We felt the threat. We knew it to be real. So that would be one context. The politics of the United States is really based on the induction of fear. And really, in some ways, each of the major parties amplifies the fear of the other returning to the White House. It's a great way to get votes. But it's also a great way to mobilize the darker and more scared. parts of people. So there are plenty of reasons to be attentive to the role of anxiety in grieving, the need to find ways, again, to modulate those troubling emotions, right? Perhaps in mindful meditative practices and practices of self-care, exercise, listening to soothing music, maybe prayerful contemplative prayer. All of these can be practices that help attenuate that siren of anxiety and allow us to hear a deeper signal of living that is more basic still.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate those strategies that you've listed. I had one client that said to me, my anxiety feels like I'm filled with broken glass. And so we did the body mind kind of strategies to bring them down and put them in that center place.
Yes.
That was helpful. It took a lot of time.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, these are not quick fixes. Anxiolytic medication, anti-anxiety medication can play a role, but of course it is addictive. It is a kind of temporary shortcut. Developing a capacity to sit with troubling experiences non-reactively is a deeper process and a longer one. But once installed, your life will be changed forever.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And to be able to return to that place over and over because you know you can. You know that place.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yes. I also wanted to talk about post-loss growth. And I am just so taken by Jo's wisdom as she was sharing with you the role of loss in her life and still moving forward as she has in her life.
Yeah, she's a very joyous person, despite all of the travail that she has been through.
Joyous Jo, huh?
Yep, well, that's one way of saying it, yeah.
Yes, yes. What have you seen over these decades of your profound experience with people, Bob, of some of the examples of people growing after a loss?
Oh, I think immediately of a number of clients, recent ones and ones in the more distant past. I remember working with a couple, Tricia and Scott, whose daughter Christine died by suicide at the age of 19 after a very stormy adolescence, a wonderful exemplary childhood, loving and beloved child whose vision just darkened as she hit adolescence and ended up having multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, multiple suicide attempts, one of which she ultimately completed at the age of 19. And that was, of course, something that just decimated this family. They were, shaken to the core by the experience. It was a seismic event, earthquake of emotional earthquake. But in the aftermath of that, I remember having a conversation with them 11 months after her suicide, as we were beginning to anticipate that anniversary date. They had about 5 months of therapy with me and really were in an enormously better place. But we had this kind of follow-up meeting in order to check how they're doing as the date loomed close. And she said, Bob, one thing that this taught me is that there are a lot of things that just don't matter. It's like I'm at work or something. She was a nurse, and she said, somebody says, oh, that fax didn't go through. And she just wants to say, get a grip. Nobody died. It'll be all right. We're going to deal with this. And she said, I realized that, you can't take anything for granted. Scott could go off to work on a Monday and get killed on the road. And because the day that Christine took her life. It was just an ordinary day like any other day, and nothing's guaranteed. And so what we find is that we really take more care with the special times, right? To have meaningful encounters with people we care about, to let go of the trivial things and to find a place for the important ones. And she elaborated on this, and she said, I feel stronger now because I realize if we can get through this, we can get through anything. Nothing in my life can ever again be this bad. And that's a kind of consolation. And so that's an example of some of what we call post-traumatic growth, which often takes the form of deepening our heart of compassion, as you say, breaking it open to receive the pain of others in a non-reactive way. We don't try to make it all better by finding the right thing to make you, don't feel that way, honey, that kind of thing. To also just to often deepen our personal philosophies or our spiritual frames, to recognize the reality of resilience, our own inner strength, in a lot of ways, then to clarify our life values, to appreciate things more. And so it is a multidimensional experience of growth that is well recognized. It often comes in the longer term aftermath of working through a loss. It's not likely to be there in the first couple months. But a couple years down the road, we may find that we are changed, and not only for the worse, but in some respects for the better by the experience. Now, we would give all of that back in a heartbeat to get our loved one back.
Yes.
That must always be acknowledged. But when that is not literally possible, then we begin to ask, what now is mine to do?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And who am I now?
Who am I now? Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This has been so heart-opening, so instructive. Thank you so much. The intention of this is certainly to provide education, and you've given us so much and inspiration as well. So as our time together today comes to a close, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience, Bob?
I guess I would suggest maybe a note of hope. When we are in a very dark place, it's hard for us to imagine that it will ever get better. And in some important ways, that itself is instructive. It won't get better in the ways that we hoped it would. Maybe our loved one had a serious illness and we hoped or even prayed for a miracle or reversal. That didn't happen. But we can move toward a life that is hopeful, a life that is maybe that takes orientation even from death, and that recognizes that we are wired for attachment in a world of impermanence, and we find ways of maintaining the attachments or the bonds even to those we've loved and lost as a tangible presence with us. And we similarly then can embrace relationships with others. So I think I do want to just emphasize that hope. There are so many folks who are in some ways wiser and more compassionate as a function of what they've suffered. Allow yourself to become one of them.
Allow yourself to become one of them. Thank you so much for the gift of your presence, your wisdom, and your guidance for all of us today. It's been absolutely wonderful.
Best of success with this.
Thank you.